Okay, so I think we're supposed to learn the Lulav Hagazul now, right? We're at the bottom of Lamed Hey Amud Beis. Part of the Sukkah, I should have put this in a different order, but we're going to have to go back a little bit to Rashi to see how Rashi understands this Gemara. Just a few lines, but you see that there's actually a major machlokas there. That you'll have the sources. There's a short source sheet also, so you can follow along here. I put it in the order we're going to see it. It says niklaf. That's a peeled esrog. Anybody here ever peel an esrog? Not really. It's not something we do because it would destroy your esrog. But let's say the esrog was peeled. Why? Because like what happened with my mother-in-law, she wanted to peel lemons, so she took we have an esrog tree and we eat esrogim around the house like we eat lemons. So sometimes you cut the esrog. Yeah. Rabbi Nadel said, bring in some esrogim and use them as a demonstration. I said, yes, but I want the esrogim to stay on the tree. I'm not going to start picking all my esrogim off the tree to show you what different things are. But esrogim that grow in the wild have all these different features. So this is a peeled esrog. Rava says, Amar Rava, Hai ethrocha de'ichlid ki ahena sumka keshera. It says this esrog that was iglid. Iglid apparently is Aramaic for being peeled. But really it means, what's a glid in Aramaic? It's like ice. Okay, like the word glida, and sometimes the frost mentioned in Bishalach, the frost that came with the months. So there's iglid also, means it got smooth. How do you smooth an esrog? An esrog is bumpy. The way to smooth an esrog is by peeling it. And he says it's a ahena sumka. What's a ahena sumka? Sumka means it's red, and it says here it's like a tamara, right? You seen that? So it's been peeled, so now the fruit is exposed. It's still kosher. That's what Rava's statement is. If you turn back a page to the Mishnah, you see here it says that there's niklaf nistak mikayv v'chaser koshu pasul. It's been perforated. Someone punched a hole right through the esrog. Niklaf is psul. So how does Rava get away with telling us now in the Gemara that no, peeled esrog is actually still kosher? And the answer is lo kasha ha bechula ha b'miktsasa. The Gemara is very short here. No, there is no kasha. One's referring to when the esrog wasn't peeled entirely. And the other one's referring to when the esrog is just peeled partially. But the Gemara does not say, so which one is the psul and which one's the hechsher. Right? See that? Is the Gemara clear? Well, Rava says it's kosher. Mishnah says it's pasul. Which one's which? Entirely, one's entirely, one is partially. And it's certainly not clear from the Gemara which one is which. Maybe the Gemara assumed that we should know. So we'll first see what Rashi says. But I'd also would like to note, if you turn over here, what does it mean that it's red? Has anybody ever peeled an esrog or seen an esrog? Normally, a healthy esrog that you're going to eat is what color? Well, what was that?
Inside?
Yeah, whitish.
White.
Yeah, okay. The skin is supposed to be yellow, or at least begins yellow.
I used it to make esrog wine.
Good. So esrog's very healthy. But what does it mean here? It says reddish. Okay. What does it mean by reddish over here? So just to explain this, you go down to the Rush. I brought here the Rush. It says it's on the third page, I think. Perish Rush Yud Zayin. You could also find this if you have a hard copy of the Gemara. You turn to page 128 in the Rush for the explanation of the redness. He says, Niklaf Omarava Hayat Roga de Iglid Kiahani Sumka Kasher. That's the Gemara. Perish Shel Achar Shnitla Klipa Hu Ma'adim Kitmara. Once you peel it, it starts reddening. If you would peel an esrog all the way to the pulp, the part you could actually eat.
Does that mean that?
Yeah, it starts oxidizing, and sometimes even if it doesn't, it's not iron necessarily, it starts turning colors. He says, like any other fruit, you peel it, it starts turning reddish. What does it mean reddish? Chazal, they didn't have Crayola, they didn't have our modern Hebrew learning the colors in Gan. Kahol wasn't even a color. Kahol is a substance. Like we said yesterday, Techeles is not a color. Techeles is a substance. It means wool dyed blue. Kahol is not a color. Kahol means eyeshadow or eye ointment that happen to be blue. In Chazal's terminology, there's only two main colors. There's reds and greens. Red covers everything from orange to purple and browns, and green covers everything from yellow to blue. See? There you go. And also that was the way it was in ancient Greek. They had very few words for colors. So that's why Rashi, when he says yarok, he says like a karte, like a leek, green like a leek. Why do you say it? Because Rashi says yarok is also tcheles. Tcheles looks like the sky. I've never seen the sky turn green. The sky is a bluish color. We have more words, so we describe things with more precision, but they didn't have it back then. So he says red, it means it's turning brownish. Okay, you peel an esrog, it starts to oxidize, and then it, like any other fruit, It says here, ha ma'adim kitmara aduma, it turns into a red date. Has anybody seen a date that's not brown? The dates that we eat, it's brownish, right? What? Well, oh no, fresh dates are yellow. Yeah. Yes. So real fresh dates, like you see growing on certain trees around the neighborhood, they're supposed to be yellow. It's only when they dry them and they process them or you freeze them, then they turn brownish. But real fruit has real color, and there's very few fruits that are actually brown, just like prunes. You take plums. Plums have lots of different colors, but for some reason, when they all become prunes, they're all much darker, right? They all blacken. Fine. V'chein kol peirot haniklafin ma'adimin. You peel any fruit, it'll turn red. It means it oxidizes. Umayri shelo nitel et haklipa ha'aduma v'lo nitel min ha'levan. Okay, this is the part we don't need to see yet. We'll get back to that. So that's the Rosh's explanation. Why is it talking about an esrog that turned red? Normally, if you sit here, if someone's just reading this literally, he would have the problem that someone asked Rabbi Soloveitchik. They're talking about blood that turned green. There's actually blood that turned green. Certain Gemaras talk about the colors of blood. It means no, blue blood, deoxygenated blood is blue. So when Chazal talked about blood that was green, they meant blue blood, not talking about green blood. So too, it doesn't mean literally here you're finding an esrog that's red. So what's the machlokas Rashi and Rabbeinu Chananel? How to understand this Gemara? Well, what does it mean? One peeled esrog is kosher, and one peeled esrog is pasul, like the Mishnah says. I'll read you. Rashi says it says Rei Kan Rashi 1. There's a Rashi downstairs. That's the Rashi that you would find on Lamid Dalid Amud Beis to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says Niklaf is a type of pasul. He also mentioned different ways of perforating this. Okay, so what is Niklaf pasul? He says Nistak and Nikev. Okay, what does it mean there? Tani Ula Bar Chanina Benikav Nekev Mifulash B'Mashu V'Shena Mifulash Ke'isar. There's Ula says on this page that if it's pierced a certain way, so Nekev Mifulash B'Mashu. If it's just pierced slightly, that's enough. That's considered a Nekev Mifulash means it goes all the way through. And the Mashu talks about the size of the hole. V'Shena Mifulash Ke'isar. And if it's not pierced all the way, it's like an Isar. Fine. I forgot to mention, I should put this over here. Before we get into this, I didn't answer the question I asked first. It went out of order. What does Rashi, Rabbeinu Chananel argue about this whole case? I want someone to suggest to me right now. What does it mean that it's partially peeled or fully peeled? Which one's kosher and which one's not? Give me an argument. Anybody have an argument why one should be kosher, why one shouldn't be? Anybody learn this Gemara ever? No. So I'll read you Rashi over here. Inside. He says, Bechula, entirely peeled is kosher, right? That's kind of weird, right? Rashi says, if you peel the esrog entirely, it's kosher, like Rava says. B'miktsasa pasul diminumarhu. If you peel it partially, now it looks like a speckled esrog. You selectively peel your esrog, it's minumar, like a leopard has spots. So that is pasul. Well, yeah. So yeah, you're not. Yeah, you need a background to see it. That's Rashi's opinion. Someone give me a difficulty with this. I thought like this is a surprise. If you're Tosafos and anybody else who reads this Gemara, or your Rav Steinsaltz, you'd say an entirely peeled esrog is kosher. Why is that surprising? Because throughout the Mishnah, we're talking about defects to the esrog. We're talking about removing parts of the esrog. Normally, these defects are only skin deep. And if you're not dissecting your esrog, the most, I guess the easiest way to check for deformities in your esrog is to what? Inspect the skin. No one ever checks the esrog's insides. You assume it's good on the inside. So why would Rashi say entirely pure the esrog? That's kosher. Needless to say, therefore, that there are many of those other Rishonim disagree with Rashi's assessment. They say no, entirely peeled is pasul, partially peeled is still kosher. Who holds like that? Rabbeinu Chananel holds that way. Do you have a Rabbeinu Chananel here? It's mentioned by the Tosfos, and I'll also read you what the Rambam says. We don't have the Rambam in front of us. Rambam says that Niklaf kulo pasul, nishar kol shehu kasher. Niklaf kulo pasul, opposite of what Rashi says. And miktsasa must mean a little remains. Okay? When it says miktsasa, it's not talking about mostly partially peeled. It means some of the skin is still there. It means if you have any of the skin remaining, so now it's still kosher. Like I said, that's the machlokas Rashi. and the Rambam. When I read the Mishnah over here about Nikev and Nistak, it's kind of funny because Nikev is mentioned twice in the Mishnah. If you look at your Mishnah, it says Nikev chaser koshu pasul. You pierce the esrog, put a hole in it, so it's pasul. And then the Mishnah says Nikev v'lo chasar koshu kasher. You pierced it, but nothing's been defected from it, so it's still kosher. Rashi says there Nikev v'chaser koshu chada milsa. Okay, Nikev v'chaser koshu. You read together. The perforation, the fact that he pierced it, did not result in anything actually missing. It's like a person. Many of us have female relatives who have pierced their ears. The act of piercing the ear does not reduce the matter of the ear. There's no removal of anything. It's just making a hole in what is. Okay, and then you put an earring in there. It looks nice. And apparently, it doesn't even hurt. So that's what Rashi is describing here. The ilu nikev v'lo chasar. Okay, if it was nikev and nothing was taken out, shetachav bo machat v'otziyah. Let's say you stuck in a pin and just pulled it out. Kasher k'tani seifa. It's kosher, like the end of the Mishnah says. So when it says nikev, it means that he lost some of it. Nikev v'chasar kol shehu. The first nikev in the Mishnah, when it says pasul, it means making the hole defected the esrog. There's something actually missing from the esrog. If you would weigh the esrog after he punctured it, because something came off, the esrog now weighs less. Whereas when the Mishnah says nikev v'lo chasar kol shehu, is specifically saying that's the type where he poked it with the pin, and now nothing's missing. Now that we have that introduction, we can understand what Rashi is going to talk about here. The Gemara says, this is the first line in the Gemara. Hold on one second. Okay, yeah, fine. I wrote myself a note, and I would make sure not to forget. Tani, Ula bar Chanina, Nikev, Nekev mifulash b'mashu. Ula says something that's not explicit in our Mishnah. Imagine he had a pin that was really long. He could puncture the esrog entirely through. It means he saw the pin come out the other side. So now there's a hole that goes straight through the esrog. It could very well be, like I said, a pinhole, but it's a hole that goes all the way through. What is the case of this? Bimashu. Okay. What does bimashu mean? Bimashu, it's apparently an isser. The threshold for an isser. Okay. Let's make this assumption. Don't always assume. But when he says nikev nekev mefulash bimashu, he's saying as perhaps as an isser. Yeah. Otherwise, there's no reason to say it. It means as a psul. A disqualification of the esrog would be if he punctured it all the way. And if it's a hole that doesn't go all the way, so I guess the hole's size is like an isar. Let's see what Rashi says over here. For those are on the inside, it says here, Anike v'lo chaser kai. Ula's modifying the Mishnah's statement when the Mishnah said still kosher. Nike v'lo chaser koshu. That should be once again a valid esrog. However, the machsher, the Mishnah said that's kosher. He made a hole in the esrog, nothing was reduced, it's still kosher. But if that hole that doesn't actually reduce from the esrog were to go through all the way, according to Ula bar Chanina, then you'd still have a psul. That is, there's yet another way to pasul an esrog, or many ways to pasul an esrog. The only way you could puncture the esrog without pasuling it is if it's a small puncture that doesn't reduce anything. But if the puncture takes off part of the esrog, or if the puncture has a large enough hole, or if the puncture goes through all the way, 3 ways to pasul the esrog, then the esrog is pasul. So if you're writing a chart, we should have. Do we ever bring in a whiteboard here? No. How can you learn Gemara without a whiteboard? Okay. In the old days, we used to use a chalkboard. So once again, Rashi is saying that Ula is modifying the kosher case and reducing the kosher case. The kosher case said small pinhole in the esrog doesn't take anything out. The esrog is still kosher. Ula says, yeah, but if the hole is big, if it has a wide radius, let's say, as an isar, how big is an isar? Anybody see an isar? It would be similar to our modern day shekel coins. Okay, you have a big hole like an isar, if it was talking about that specific coin. Or if the hole goes through all the way, so it is pasul. Why is this important? Because there's a machlokas over here. Ula says, Ravid says that Ula is addressing the ratio of the Mishnah. The ratio of the Mishnah says, Nikev has puzzled it. Okay, and says, what does the Mishnah say? Nikev v'chasar mashu. I'll read it here. Nikev v'chasar kol shehu. Nikev v'chasar kol shehu. He made a puncture, and some of his was removed. Ula is saying that is not so clear in the Mishnah. It's not a complete psul. He also has to make sure it goes through all the way or has a hole big enough. So Ravid is more makel in his understanding of this Gemara than Rashi is. The Rambam in his Psak follows, I believe, Rashi. Okay, that is, there's all sorts of different punctures that could possibly your esrog. The only kind that doesn't possible is it has to be a pinhole and it doesn't go through all the way and does not reduce any of the esrog. Does that make sense? I hope so. Has anybody seen here where they go shopping for esrogim and they check them under magnifying glasses? And if you see them, they do it like Zupnik and other places. You buy the esrog and you discover that it has a detectable deformity. You could bring it to the Moreh Hora who's sitting there, and I'll give the fellow a certificate. He gets his money back from the dealer. Have you seen that? Okay, this is a very Hasidish type of thing. It's a very interesting thing to watch. Perhaps it's not necessary, because if you need a magnifying glass to detect a psul and you need to bring it to the rabbi to go over the magnifying glass, perhaps it's, you don't need to go that far. Okay, let's see what Rava says. Bye, Rava. Nodu ba'ethrog simane trefa mahu. Ooh, good question. This was alluded to in the previous Rashi's here. We're going to perhaps make an equation. Anybody here shech before? Or check for treifas? No one? Okay, fine. If you were, let's say, the most basic shechita of a chicken, the most common one in this country also. So you shech the chicken, you have to do an inspection on the insides to see how the lungs are and other internal organs, so that there's not some sort of deformity there, what's halachically considered a treifa. And when discussing these matters, the sages use similar terminology. They talk about niklaf, nistak, and what is that? A knee cave, perforations, peelings, similar terminology. If they're using similar terminology, does it mean it's the same standards? Now, I don't know. Does an esrog have internal organs? It's a fruit. It doesn't have internal organs, but they notice that an esrog, when you cut it open, it looks like, especially cut in half, it looks like it has two lobes. And there's like veiny things going through those two lobes. And when you cut open, let's say, a chicken, the major part of the chest cavity is occupied by what? The lungs. And as you know, lungs is a major issue where they check for treifas. Most of the treifas they find are in lungs, and that's where the whole idea of glot kosher comes from. Although the Rambam didn't hold of glot kosher, ironically. Okay, which is a shiur for another time. So he says, is the equation complete? Do we say that whatever has treifas, okay, if let's say you find in your esrog, it's simone treifas, like you'd find in an animal, does that disqualify the esrog? Which is an amazing question when you come to think about it. I wouldn't have thought to ask such a question, but Chazal said, because, and Rava thought this, Rava lived in the 2nd century in Bavel, and he saw it when he studied the Mishnayos, the terminology is so similar, perhaps the halachas are meant to be similar also. Someone pointed out to me, Rabbi Nakotel said, when it comes to the Jewish calendar, everything has to do with birth. What do we call an extra month? An ibur, pregnant. Yeah, Me'uberet. And also the day, the 30th day of every month. If you add a 30th day to the month, that's the Yom HaIbur. And the new moon is called the Molad and the Nolad. All this terminology about birth. Okay. For good reason, yes. Rebirth of the Jewish people, like we say in Kiddush Levana. So when is the terminology significant? And the Gemara asks, "My kami baile." I put this in red because of kasha. E niklaf tanina. If you're saying, well, perhaps an esrog that's been peeled, just like certain membranes are missing from the kishkas of the animal, well, we already said in the Mishnah that's a problem. Niklaf is a psul. E nisdak. If you're talking about it has a crack in there somewhere, okay, there's a separation developing. So we also said an esrog has a concept of nisdak, a cutting through the esrog. E nikev tanina. And if you're talking about perforated esrogim, just like perforated lungs, we have that in the Mishnah also. So the Mishnah is quite clear that when it uses the terminology similar to the halachas of treifas, it is talking about psulim of an esrog. So ki kamibayile, here's a clarification or a more specific question. When he was asking this question, Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he's asking within the opinion of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Reya shenishbecha kikiton k'sheira. Rabbi Yochanan says that if you have a lung that's basically become liquefied, a ketone is like a bottle of water. Okay, so the lung has been so infected or decomposed that it's mostly liquefying. You should never see such a thing like this, but it happens sometimes. So that's kosher. Vama Rava, v'hu dekaima simponaha. And Rava said, yeah, but as long as the simponot are still around, the lungs have areoles and other bronchi, and and bronchioles. So you look at the lungs; it's not just a spongy material. There's veiny things that go through it. Those are where there's some of them are blood vessels, and others are passages for the oxygen. The air comes down through the throat and spreads out in the lungs. So he says that if you have this animal, its lungs are basically liquefied. So how is it able even to breathe? And it turns out the animal survived. And it's not a treifa because the simponot are still there. The simponot, the various bronchi and areoles that are inside the lungs. We don't have a demonstration. You know what? We should get a picture of this. Perhaps we could see it. I'll bring it next time. Ha lo kaimi simpona treifa. And if these simponaha, which by the way, this is a Greek word from meaning tubes. So if they're not around, so the animal's a treifa. Ha ha chamai. So what do we do here? I don't think there's supposed to be hay there. You could cross off that hay. That's because they're supposed to. Well, some of them still are. It's not meaning completely liquid. It means it's like liquidy. No, it's the lungs. The lungs have the lungs are sort of begun liquefaction of themselves. Yeah. So it's held within the pleura. You talking about a human or are you talking about a chicken? Humans and chickens? Okay, so this is
basic physiology and anatomy is basic. You actually describe it. You have a bronchus, you have a main tube that comes down, and it eats up the line. It's more huge until the line is so thin that you can exchange oxygen with carbon dioxide. That's the whole purpose of the position. This water around.
Yeah.
He didn't get it on the position.
It's okay. I do know that there are differences that sometimes what would affect the human doesn't affect the animal so much. They get around better for some reason. Just like they eat dirt and we can't. Chickens, they're just pecking stuff in the dirt. And also that thing about pressure. Remember collapsed lung? I remember there was a big talk about it happened on an airplane. Some woman suffered a collapsed lung mid-flight and they did an emergency surgery to her. So they had to relieve the pressure because he's saying like the pressure differential causes the lung to be compressed. I think basic physics say that depends on the size. Certain animals, if they would suffer something that would give a human a collapsed lung, would not suffer collapsed lung necessarily. Also the way they're oriented. A human, we're straight up, whatever it is. I don't know if this is necessary, but chickens are more like that, the way they're oriented. So all these little issues make it a difference that you could have a chicken that you didn't know was suffering from this malady until the time of shechita. And when it says that the lungs are like this, it doesn't mean entirety. It just means part of it. Okay, it's supposed to be the bottom part of it, of just one of them. If it was the entire lung, so obviously it might even be dead. The point is, you find a treifa. Most treifas is not that the whole thing is a problem. You find the hole here. You find membrane missing here. It's a spot problem. Either way, so we see here that there was this case of the chicken lungs, perhaps even behema, that it had this problem. So they ask, Hachamai, your esrog is slightly liquefied in the inside, but you see the veins or whatever it is in the esrog, those are still around. Is that a psul in the esrog? Well, I'd like to say, if you could see this in the esrog, you've already cut your esrog in half. My nafkamina, a cut esrog in half is certainly not kosher. So what's the question? The answer is, if you cut your esrog after yontif, or you cut your esrog on Chol Hamoed, what happened? You took the esrog, and then someone cuts it in half, a la ushpizen, like in that movie, the classic movie. At the very end, they cut the esrog in half, the $1,000 esrog. So then he sees it. So it means if the esrog was puzzle, it means that he did not fulfill the obligation earlier. So he should go get himself another esrog. Like what always happens to me. Said I have an esrog tree. Last year, they ordered me into isolation for some reason. I wasn't sick, but apparently someone next to me had stuck something in his nose and found out that he had a China virus. So I had to stay home because this person had knocked on my door previously. So I didn't fight this thing. So I was stuck at home all sukkahs. And my son broke my esrog. He knocked off the okets. So I picked one off the tree. And the next day I ate the first esrog that was puzzle. And then he knocked off the okets of that esrog. So I picked another esrog. And every day of Chol Hamoed had a new esrog. So what they're teaching here is that a person who discovers he had a puzzle esrog should go get himself a new esrog. Or make sure his neighbor is the guy who sells esrogin. Hachamai, Dilma Hasam hu delo shalit be avira. Could very well be that this animal's still kosher, even though it has this liquefaction of the lungs, because lo shalit be'aviro, the air did not rule over it. That's a literal expression. In Aramaic, this would mean that it's not exposed. The animal was still whole when he was alive, so it was closed, and his lungs have this problem, but it's not showing to the outside world. It's not like the air touches it directly. So that's why the animal's still kosher. Hadar bari, and he could have healed himself. The chicken could have, I don't know, whatever it was, God would have protected the chicken, and his lungs would have healed. Of a hacha, when we talk about the esrog, the shalid ba'avira, if the esrog is exposed already, it's open to the air, sruche misrachas, the esrog will now spoil, like any other fruit. You cut, once you stop chopping up fruit, it could go bad or it could actually ferment. Or maybe there's no difference. So the question is, an esrog that has this symptom, like we'd find in a behemoth that's been shechted, what is the status of the esrog? So the Gemara offers an answer, Tashma, esrog tapuach, in this case, tafuach, kamitz, no dot mataf. In the word tapuach, there's a patach and a dot mataf. That's specific. So this means tafuach, meaning it's inflated or it's swollen. Why would an esrog swell? Well, certain fruits, have you ever seen a watermelon swell here? You have good, here the supermarkets don't have the bad watermelons. Sometimes you go out to the sticks, like where I live, you get the watermelons come off the truck, and every now and then there's a watermelon gets a boo-boo on its way down to the truck, and it starts going bad. And then the esrog, the watermelon is starting to ferment inside, and gas builds up, and then the watermelon pops. So you can see swollen, spoiled watermelons, or like they say, you have a carcass of a whale also washes up on the shore. It starts to get all bad inside, and then it might even pop. So that's what we're talking about here. Tapua, esrog, tafuach, saruach, kavush. Oh, he pickled the esrog. Not bad. Shaluk, it's been cooked. Kushi, lavan. Apparently, kushi means dark. We're going to see what does it mean by kushi. Umanumar, pasul. Or if it's speckled, it's pasul. Esrog kichadur pasul. If it's too round, doesn't have a nice esrog shape, so it's also pasul. The Yishamrim af hatiom, or twin esrog. Sometimes an esrog has looks like two stamens. It's like you have double bananas or double cucumbers. Also, a lot of the good grocery stores, so they pick out those ones, but it happens. Esrog haboser means unripe esrog. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim, and the sages. Rabbi Akiva says that's also disqualified. The esrog is unripe, but the sages would allow such an esrog. Gidelo bidfus v'asoo kamin bria acheret pasul. If he grew the esrog in a mold, okay, Rashi even uses this word mold here. I think see it in French. He has a similar word here. He says that you put the esrog, this mold around the esrog, so that it would get a nice shape like some other fruit, like a banana shape, let's say. So now it's perfectly esrog. There's no blemishes. It's also pasul. Now the Gemara is going to sum up the question or sum up the proof. My love, tafuach mibachutz, v'saruach mibafnim. The first case talking about an esrog that's tafuach means you can see from the outside swelling, and it also means saruach. When it says the esrog is spoiled, it means inside it's spoiled. So that should be a proof. If you have an esrog with its spoiled innards, like I guess liquefied lungs, so to speak, that's the analogy. So that would be pasul. Well, maybe there's a way to tell. Maybe it has a smell or something. But like I said, you'd only know once you cut it. But it means nafkamina is where you go say beforehand, or you could already smell it. Yeah, or maybe it's squishy. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Yeah.
From radiologists did an MRI.
Again, the MRI, the esrog. The Chazal didn't have that problem, because there's no way. Okay, but you could X-ray your esrogin. Would an esrog show up on an X-ray? The internal structures of an esrog show up on an X-ray, or is it too weak? Well, yeah, because
MRI is better, right?
when you X-ray, I saw an X-ray recently. When you X-ray, let's say a broken bone in the arm, so the bones show up, but it goes right through the flesh. You can't really tell flesh wounds from an X-ray, can you? Yeah. Okay. So I guess you have to be very gentle. Do a very gentle X-ray to the esrog to check it. It was a very rare condition. Either way, the Gemara suggests this suggestion to proof that an esrog would not be exactly like a treifa. An esrog with such a condition, the way we first read this, would be pasul, not like the animal. Yeah. Oh, ultrasound. Okay. Fine. Sometimes they had no choice. There were times in history, even in Bavel, where esrogim were not common. Esrogim were not common. If I may digress, the Mishnah Berurah writes, why do they have the minhag? You remember at Chutz La'aretz they used to put on tefillin and chol moed? Probably not like here. So when do you take off your tefillin and chol moed? Or Musafar. Okay, you're thinking Rosh Chodesh. Even that's a question. You say before Hallel. That's the way it has in the article. That's minhag article. Why before Hallel? Mishnah Berurah explains because that's when we take the esrog break. There's only one set of arba minim in the entire shul, and all 20 men need a chance to shake the lulav and esrog. So it's a considerable break before Hallel. So take off your tefillin then. Okay, so esrogim, times and places where you don't really have it, especially used to be where they grew esrogim sometimes in the Caribbean, sometimes in Sicily and other places. Nowadays, we're very fortunate. Like I said, you could have an esrog tree in your yard if you don't want to pay 100 shekels for an esrog. And I think it's the better way to go. Okay, so it says here, this suggestion that perhaps the esrog is unlike the behemoth's lungs is rejected. Idi v'idi mibachutz. When it says tafuach and saruach are both referring to blemishes that are visible from the outside or affected on the skin. Lo kasha, and there's no kasha. Had tafach afagav de lo sarach. Had the sarach afagav de lo tafach. It means one is a disqualification of the esrog. It's swelling, even though it's not really spoiling, or it's spoiling but it's not swelling because there's something that's letting off the pressure. But so far this is inconclusive. Rava's question is therefore unanswered. We don't have a question, even though an animal is not considered a treifa if it has these liquefaction of the lungs. We don't know if it has liquefaction of the esrog on the inside, if that is a psul of the esrog. The sages mostly discuss things just on the outside of the esrog. Okay, that's a good question. Amar Mar ethrog kushi pasul. In this brisa we just mentioned the esrog kushi. Literally speaking, kushi means what? Well, it means Ethiopian. Okay, right. So this is a borrowed term. There's an Ethiopian. Well, it doesn't say Tzipor is a Kushi. It says Moshe Rabbeinu had a wife who was a Kushi. So Rashi, based on the Medrash, says it's the same Tzipora who's a Midyanith. So Kushi became a borrowed term. First, they said Kushi means Ethiopian. When you're talking about an Ethiopian person, and by the way, it doesn't mean what you and I call the state of Ethiopia today. It basically meant everything from Sudan in the south. The Sudanese had a civilization around classical times. It even says the largest army mentioned in the Bible was from Cush. It says in the time of King Asa and Divrei Yamim that King Asa of Judah was attacked by Zerach HaKushi, who came with an army of Elef Alafim. I used to point out the only time a million men, an actual number of a million in the Bible, Elef Alafim, a 1,000,000-man march of people was from the ruler of Cush at the time. How did he get through Egypt? At the time, the Sudanese, Zerach the Kushi, king of Sudan, also was controlling Egypt at the time. So he took his gigantic army and he attacked Jerusalem, and it was an amazing victory for the Jewish people. There's no holiday about it because they didn't make holidays in First Temple times. So then it used to be that people south of Egypt, from Sudan in the south, they were what you and I know as black. They were darker than, let's say, people around here in the Middle East. So it became that Kushi was just synonymous with being a person who's black. And even later, in the sages' times, it means a person who's exceptionally different in some way. Okay? So the question is, when we say Esrog Kushi, do we mean the most basic Ethiopian? Or do we mean one that's black? Or like a person, borrow the term from a person? Or do we mean something that's just exceptional? So we're not going to go as far as say exceptional. The only question is, does it mean actually black, or does it mean Ethiopian? Now, I give a good argument that it doesn't mean black, simply because it can't be a borrowed term, because there are no such things as black esrogim. Adarabba, what's across from Ethiopia, across the body of water, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea, what do you have on the other side? Yemen. And the finest esrogim come from Yemen. And it's a similar climate. And what do we know about Yemenite esrogim, which they've had for thousands of years? That's their size. Rabbi Akiva's football size that he had to bring on his shoulders. Yemenite esrogim are just as yellow as all the other esrogim. Growing south doesn't change the color of the esrog. So it seems, just based on this, if nowadays we know this, I can understand why Rishonim in Europe had a havamina that maybe it's referring to the color of the esrog, or this esrog is discolored. But usually there's no breed of esrog that's, as far as we know, that's not yellow upon ripening. And esrog does turn darker when it shrivels, but that's talking about already a dry esrog, right? You've seen this esrogs turn reddish and brown. That's not what the Chazal are talking about. They're talking about a ripe fruit, and it goes from green to yellow. There's no such thing as a red esrog. By the way, that's why an orange is called an orange. Orange is a new breed of citrus fruit. Why is it called an orange? New thing, because it has the color orange. Okay, it's called an orange because it's a new fruit, and we called it an orange because it's orange. Okay, it explains American English here. Well, yeah, it means a color. Yeah, it means something for the color. Well, from the French, but the French, orange is a place in South France, right? Like the Duke of Orange, and but it means the color. It became a color in English. It became the color. So, by the way, why do they have this? Like we said before, there used to be no word specifically for orange. In all the languages, like our own, orange was just a form of red. So it meant a citrus fruit that's redder than the others, the orange. Okay, and orange juice is yellow. Go figure. V'atanya kushi kasher domele kushi pasul. Okay, kushi. It says in the brisa. Sorry, kushi kasher domele kushi is pasul. It says a kushi is kosher in this brisa. Machlokas brises, and it says something that's like a kushi is pasul. So Abaye says, Amar Abaye, Kditan nami masdisan domel kushi tznan. Our Mishnah, which says a kushi is pasul, our brisa, which fits the says a kushi is pasul, is referring to the same brisa, the same one that the brisa that you just introduced, the one that I put in red over here, is domel kushi. And Rava says differently. Rava says no, lo kasha halon halahu. Those are for us, and those are for them, which also is ambiguous. In certain places, kushi is kosher, and in certain places, kushi is not. But why did Rava say? But he says that is Rava going to deal with domela kushi pasul. Okay, little difficulty. Now let's see how the Rishonim understand this. I'll read you Rashi, and also give you a little bit of what is said there before we daven mincha. Unless we have to be ekis, is there a certain point where we have to stop and start mincha?
Well, according to me, really, well,
Okay, but there's not. Are people coming here and expecting to catch a mincha besides everybody's here? Oh, it's okay. Okay, fine. What? Oh, not going to. Okay, no, they're after us out. Okay, so look at Rashi. Let's understand what Rashi says first. Understand this Gemara. He says Domelakushi. He says Shagadal Khan. Where's the Khan? Rashi's writing in France. But Rashi's giving you words to put into the mouths of Abaye and Rava. So the Khan here is referring to Bavel. So Rashi says Domel Kushi is an esrog that grew in Bavel, and it is black. Okay? So it's dark. Now, there's no reason to assume that just because the people who come from Kush are darker than the people who live in Eretz Yisrael, the people who live in Norway. It doesn't mean that everything that comes from Kush is inherently darker. It doesn't mean that their sheep are all black. It doesn't mean that their bananas are black. It doesn't mean their apples are black, right? There's no reason to assume that. So Rashi is telling you here, it grew here in Bavel. Domel Kushi means it grew here in Bavel, and it is black. It's just a coincidence. Why they say black means brownish. It's just a coincidence that Kushi, Esrogim, or like Kushi people, happen to be from Ethiopia and happen to be darker than people from other places. So he's saying Ethiopian Esrogim are dark. That's what Rashi says. Pasul, Shednidmehu. Okay, it looks like something that is not supposed to look like. That's the psul, because it doesn't look the way it's supposed to look. Rashi throws in French. Anybody here know what this French word means? Contrefeit, like contraband or something? Anybody know? Counterfeit. Okay, you can say counterfeit. Counterfeit. Okay, that works. Okay. Okay. Rashi says further, Aval kushi atmo, hainu tam de kasher de urchehu. An actual kushi esrog, that's just its breed, so it's different. But if you had something that's not supposed to be a kushi esrog, and it looks like a kushi esrog, so now it's got a problem. Lamad over dome with people. If you had someone who was of strictly Ashkenazic descent and his skin was much darker, so you'd have that psul as a kohen, like the Rambam describes. It says a kohen who's too dark skinned or too light skinned cannot be a Kohen. He can't serve in the temple. Sorry if you're a Kohen here. Also, left-handed people should not be Kohanim. It's a problem. But, okay,
You know the reason why that penalty?
same reason I think. It doesn't look right. Just like we disqualify also a Kohen who's too tall. Yeah, I mean left-handed. Oh, different. Different is sometimes perceived as breaking the mold, literally. The halacha disqualifies a Kohen. He's not a midget. He's just much shorter than everybody else, so he'll stand out. Also, the Kohen who's too big, Kohen who's too tall. Let's say he's an excellent athlete. He's going to be part of the Israeli national basketball team. He's the center, so he's 7'1". He is not allowed to serve in the temple. He's going to stick out among other Kohanim, and also different body parts. Also, too big, he's disqualified from the Kahuna. So yeah, but he's wearing clothing. Doesn't matter. The Sanhedrin has a very tight standards. So the way Rashi understands it once again is Kushi Esrog means that it looks funny. An Esrog from Kush would be different. Huh?
Bruised, you know what bruised fruit?
No, we were just talking about bruised fruit, the previous one. We were talking about the way it grew. Bruised fruit is a lack of hitter. All right. Here Rashi's saying that the Kushi Esrog is a type of breed that happens to be darker. And if that's how it is, so that's how it is. But if you take a Babylonian Esrog that's supposed to grow in Bavel, then the breed's over here, or I guess a non-Yemenite Esrog growing in the land of Israel, it's not supposed to be so dark. And if it ends up being dark like a Kushi, it's disqualified. And that's the resolution according to Rava and according to Rashi. What? It should be okay. So Halam Lahu is referring to what? It means what? Well, not necessarily, because Rashi is interpreting it and saying that it grew here, but in Kush, where they have this Rogan like that, it doesn't stand out at all. Saying that normally Halam Lahu means Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, but we're talking about Abai and Rava, and Abai and Rava are looking at two brises from Eretz Yisrael. So they're grouping Eretz Yisrael and Bavel in one case and Kush in the other case. Halam Lahu means for us and for them. And by the way, the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim echo this. They don't say in Bavel and in Eretz Yisrael. The distinction is places where the esrogim look funny. So they say in places where the esrogim are darker, and that's their type of esrog, that esrog is kosher. But if you're in a place where the esrog is nice and light-skinned, and you have one local esrog grew differently and it's much darker than the others, it's disqualified. Okay? Yeah. So the question is, they used to not have imported esrogs, by the way. They're also assuming that importation of esrogs is not something that used to be done in the olden days on mass scale. So that's not the question they're discussing. But if you happen to get an esrog, eventually they had to do that. Nowadays, things have changed a lot differently. They used to, in the 1800s, they started, like I said, they were growing esrogim in the Americas and bringing them to the East. But that was because the British could do that. They had a navy. But before there was, these empire-building navies that were going around the world, most of history, there was no such thing as importing esrogs all over the place. We discussed the case of peeling an esrog, and we saw what does Rashi say about a peeled esrog, because there's two Mishnaic teachings. One invalidates such an esrog for ritual use, and the other allows such an esrog for ritual use. So what is the resolution? Straight contradiction. Rashi's resolution, as brought by Tosfos over here, we didn't do this on Monday because now that we've seen more of the sugya regarding the treifas. Remember we saw the esrog. The question they had was if an esrog has, suffering a similar condition to this animal that has atrophied lungs. Remember? Okay, and the chicken with the atrophied lungs is similar, maybe perhaps to an esrog. If an esrog is liquefying on the inside, and an esrog, when you cut her down the middle, it looks like lungs. Okay, so they wondered perhaps, as the Mishnah already uses similar terminology to describe the defects that would invalidate these animals. So too, perhaps esrogim would be invalidated for ritual use with defects similarly described. And that was quite an interesting sugya. There was no conclusion there. Tosfos here says what explains Rashi's position regarding the peeled esrog. Perish bekuntras b'miktsasa pasul demechse kimenumar. Well, in Tosfos right over here on Lamed Vav Amid Aleph, this Tosfos, the middle Tosfos there. Okay, the previous Tosfos talks about the previous sugya. So this is basically the first Tosfos on the sugya we did on Monday. Rashi said that if you were to partially peel the esrog, that would invalidate it because now it looks speckled. It looks menumar. It looks like a leopard. Whereas if one were to entirely peel the esrog, now at least it looks nice and consistent. It has one solid color. Actually, it's turning colors, but it still stays one solid color. So that's a kosher esrog. And we saw that there are other Rishonim who disagree. Who is the first and foremost? Rabbeinu Hananel preceded Rashi. Rabbeinu Hananel is one of the Gonim. And now you could actually read Rabbeinu Hananel's opinion. We print it, at least in my Gemara, it's printed alongside Tosfos on the outer margin. Tosfos says, Rabbeinu Hananel perish ipcha. Rabbeinu Hananel explained this Gemara the exact opposite way. Bechula pasol, the latrefus medami lebishmaitim. If you were to entirely peel the esrog, that would invalidate it. Why? Because we are going to forthwith compare the invalidation of an esrog to the invalidation of a kosher animal. Are you skinning a kosher animal? If you would skin a kosher animal alive, would that make it a treifa? Probably. But we're not talking about the outer skin. We're talking about skinning one of the internal organs. Okay, if it's been skinned. He says here, the gabe treifos ashkechan beferek elu treifos. Regarding treifos, in the parak that's called elu treifos, that's in Chulin, it describes here are the various deformations and defects you can find in an animal that would make the animal not kosher, even if it was a kosher species, and even if the shechita was performed properly, you could still find defects afterwards upon checking. Hagaluda treifa. The galuda, that means it's sort of been peeled on the inside. It's missing this internal membrane, is a treifa, not kosher. If a kasela, a little bit like a coin as big as a penny or so, and left of this membrane was still left, so that's not a treifa animal because the animal could have recovered from such a thing. They talk about a person who gets a bone marrow transplant. He doesn't have his marrow to produce the blood cells he needs. So you give him just a little bit from a healthy person, and what happens? He makes a complete recovery. Sometimes also with blood transplants, it works that, or a skin graft. And anybody knows someone who had a terrible burn, got a skin graft, had that work? He has the skin, let's say, on this arm, has got burned. It ain't coming back. He needs skin. So he takes off skin from some other place, a kazayas of skin, puts it over there. And if it works, it'll start regrowing and recover. And eventually hopefully he'll make a complete recovery, but he'll recover and live Shonim Rabos because of that. So it just takes a little bit. What? Yeah. Yes, should work, but they stick, especially if it's a good match. So that could happen. They saw that definitely what's treifa, the definition is that the defect would have killed the animal within a year. So the sages already saw that the animals that have a little bit left, they could recover and they wouldn't die. Okay, and also it seems that Gemara discusses that niklaf. Remember, he said if you want to compare the esrog to the animal, so they both have a case of niklaf that they've been peeled. Okay, Tanena, we already saw this in the Mishnah. Kolomar im siman treifa. If there's a sign or an indication of treifus, is this peeling? The ka'amrinan hainu niklaf the siman treifa. The niklaf of esrog, it must be similar to the niklaf described with the behema. Hua gluda is the case of the gluda, and that's basically why Rabbeinu Hananel and others disagree with Rashi. So this brings up a nafkamina lahalacha. So according to Rabbeinu Hananel, the chula pasul, if you perfectly peel the esrog, so it is pasul, but if it has a little bit left, it is permissible. So the esrog is still valid. How much left? So that's a machlokas. Some say, well, the minimum that the animal needs is ke'isar in order to still survive. So to the esrog just needs a little bit of peel left. And others say, no, the esrog needs a significant amount of peel. It's not entirely like an animal, so it has to be a rove or whatever it is. That's the... Well, if it's still on the tree, it would. Sometimes a little bit. Well, really? Maybe. Sometimes they do, actually. There are certain things that depends on the stage of growth. I've seen this esrogim get a blemish on the tree, and then they continue growing, and there's no blemish anymore, like a pinprick. One of the strange things that you have to protect an esrog from itself. Anybody see a real esrog tree in the wild? It's like a lemon tree. What does a lemon tree have, like an esrog tree? Thorns, really bad thorns too. So one of the things that happens is the people cultivate these. They have to cut away the surrounding branches they really got to take care of it on the tree. You don't just have to prune; you have to actually take off the thorns. Yeah. 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 Well, I take care of mine. Yeah. So as a cultivator of citrus fruits, I have quite a few trees. So this thing I have to deal with all the time. I have grapefruits and clementines, lemons, kumquats, and of course the prize is the esrog tree. So this thing I have to do is I have to watch out and keep them good. And I've seen that citrus gets pricked, so you remove that thorn, and then you let it grow bigger, and it goes away. So yeah. So really, so you don't think it is? Okay. But the point is, and here's how I'll quote the Rambam because I'm wrong, but the Rambam's usually right. The Rambam just requires a kol shehu for the esrog to recover, okay, or for the esrog to be kosher. The Rambam says the animal needed an iser amount in order to recover, but the esrog just needs a kol shehu to stay kosher. Okay, that's the Rambam's opinion. Unlike those who take the Rabbeinu Chananel to his logical conclusion, that is all the it would be you have to at least have this minimum amount for the esrog to be valid. The next Tosfos has also a line here that I think is important. What is like kadur? Okay, so you say it's like a kadur. So kadur is a biblical word already. It means spherical, or esrog that's two round. Tosfos says at the end, well, yeah, it's in the Navi. Okay, kadur is also a Mishnaic word, usually referring to a sphere. Gemara, the Mishnah talks about Avodah Zarah. The Romans had and the Greeks had statues of Atlas. Okay, who's Atlas? He's holding up the whole world. So they said that there's if you find an idol of this god holding up a globe or a kadur, so you know that's an idol. That's a statue of Atlas. So that's they had it. You should know Chazal's times. The Gemara assumes the Greeks all knew this. The world is spherical. The earth is spherical. So Baba Mice said that people actually believed the world was flat. For any significant part of history, people always knew it was round. They even calculated the radius of the earth. Okay, so the Rambam says that the Tosfos says this degarius kadur like kadud bedalit says like a dude. A dude is a pot, a rounded pot. A sui kamin dude ve'agol kikdera. It's rounded like a pot. That's what it means. Don't read it kadur, but read it like a dude. Nowadays we use the word dude where we refer to the thing that cooks the water for us on the roof. They call it dude shemesh, even though it's a flat plate. Okay, to each his own. Let's get back to the Gemara. We left off. Oh, I should put the source down. What? Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, the dude. No, but dude shemesh is flat. It's a solar plate. That's the thing that's heating it. The dude shemesh. Just the water just goes from that plate into the tank. If there's like a day like this, you don't need to have anything boiling in that pot. So or the tank. Anybody ever fix
the dude is the what holds the water, not the flat plate.
Okay, but they call it dude shemesh. Nowadays, you ask someone to fix your dude shemesh, so he'll give you one of those plates. If you ask for a dude shemesh, you'll get a plate. You can't do it. Yeah, it's the boiler. Yeah. So then you have to say, if you want specifically, you have to say the kol team. But if you just have a dude, then you don't have a kol team, and that actually works on an outside heat source. But shemesh, the second you introduce shemesh, it's a borrowed term. They used to have a dude all the time. That's how they heated water in the olden days. That's what Tosfos is describing. The shemesh aspect is like what do they say? Have you gone to the mechanic here? They say there's a back axle. What's the back axle? That's your back axle. What do they call the front axle? They don't say kidney, back axle, kidney. They borrow the term, so they do this. So they call it dude shemesh. It's not the dude shemesh they're referring to is a mechanism that solar heats the water. It's connected to the dude, which always was a dude, but now it's been borrowed. We're going to see that's the whole thing we had with esrog hakushi just now. We left off with Rashi describes Abaye's position. What was it saying in the Mishnah? Let's review this. The Mishnah. So we get things straight because it's hard to keep things straight. This is Gemara after all. The Mishnah says here, the Mishnah mentioned the Kushi. I'm gonna have to find this here. The Mishnah disqualifies all sorts of esrogim, right? It says Kasser Polshahu, and it says here. And then afterwards we got into the sugya on Lamed Vav Amid Aleph. You remember this? Esrog Amar Mar Esrog Kushi Puzzle. V'atanya kushi kosher, dom kushi pasul. Right? We saw that. That's the kasha. So we went through Abaye's teretz according to Rashi. Okay. So one more time, an esrog kushi should be pasul, and the Mishnah actually modifies it. No, it could be kosher, it could be pasul. So what's the resolution? So we saw Abaye. Rashi describes Abaye. Dom kushi shegadal kan v'ariyu shachor. It grew up here, esrog here. So it's dom kushi and it's black. Pasul. Shednidmehu. It looks like what it's not supposed to look like. And he says it's counterfeit laws of kushi atzmo haydotam the kosher de urchihu. The Abaye says very simply, if you ever find that a kushi is kosher, it's because that's just the way it is. Then all of them are like that. And kushi in this case means black, a borrowed term, not necessarily Ethiopian. It says gadil khan, so it must be the way Rashi's adding it. It grew here in Bavel apparently, as opposed to an esrog that's from Kush, which would be darker. And so here it looks different. If it grew here and it looks different than it should, so it's puzzle. And if that's the way it looks, so it's kosher. Ad Khan, Rashi explaining Abaye's answer. And then we have the Rava answer. Halon, halahu. It actually depends where you are. And as I said, this is where I left off. It sometimes doesn't mean for Israelites and Bavel. So it just means different places. And that's the way the poskim have it. They don't make this distinction, say, in Bavel it's this way, in Israel it's that way. They say it depends on where you are. And I also pointed out that it can't be the southern esrogim, the kushi. It cannot be that esrogs from Ethiopia are actually darker, because Lamaisa, esrogim that grow farther in the south are not darker. They're just as yellow as esrogim grown in the rest of the Mediterranean areas. So when they say kushi, it must be that it's dark, or at least that's how we understood. That's how maybe Chazal understood. Even if there are Rishonim who say it might be Ethiopian and that's the way they grow, because apparently there's no such thing. It says here, La'olam masdisim kushi namin pasul. Okay, Rashi says here's a understanding Rava's answer. A kushi is pasul, kushi nami pasul. Below kasher masnisim. There's no problem with the Mishnah, which would say otherwise. Livnei Eretz Yisrael sherechokin meretz kush v'enem regil mahem. So in the Mishnah or a Mishnaic teaching says that a kushi is pasul, it's talking about, for example, bnei Eretz Yisrael who are far away from the land of Kush and therefore they're not familiar with these kushi esrogim, which look different. Brisa, what does the Brisa say? Kushi kosher nidmeh is pasul. Livnei Bavel shekrovim lekush. They're kosher. They're closer to Kush. So it has to be like after Shiur. So it has. Did Rashi says Kush is closer to Bavel than it is Eretz Yisrael. That's not good. It's not that Rashi wasn't good at geography. Rashi didn't have all the information in front of him. Ramban has already pointed this out. Yeah. Yeah. So Rashi is. I want to say that it doesn't fit in. Rashi assumed that Kushi esrogim were called that because they're from Kush, and they also have to be darker. So that was Rashi's assumption. Rashi is reading the Gemara. Nowadays we know, just like Rashi makes an assumption that Bavel is closer to Kush than Eretz Yisrael is also an assumption he made that other Rishonim are not going to make, and that we would make today. The way the Rambam has it makes a lot more sense to us. Yeah. Hindu Kush. Yeah, that's a little difficult because throughout the Torah, when it refers to so that's a very Mishnaic way of thinking about it. Mehodavat Kush. The problem is whenever Eretz Kush is mentioned in historical context, it's referring to the areas south of Egypt in Africa, and the people from Kush are people of history who are mentioned in the Bible in a few different places, and it's usually referring to them. And there's even a bracha that says that because these people were unusual, they were much darker skinned than everybody else. The people who live in the Hindu Kush mountains were not necessarily any darker than the people who lived in, Paras and Madai. So it doesn't fit the Metzias. Okay. The only question is, like I said before, to introduce this idea, when Chazal called a Kushi an esrog Kushi, were they borrowing a term? Just like a person from Kush happens to be darker than everybody else around here, so too we're using this term now to describe an esrog that's darker. Or does it actually mean an esrog from Kush, which happens to be darker? So Rashi went with this latter approach. And Rashi also assumes that, once again, Kush is closer to Bavel than it is Eretz Yisrael, which is Even that is a little bit of a stretch, like Ramban said. So let's just finish Rashi, and then I'll bring you the notes we have from other Rishonim. We'll see the Rif, and we'll see the Rambam. It's very important to see all of them. Brisa of Nei Velvel Shekrovim Lakusha Regim Lahem. The Brisa which says that a kushi is kosher for people who Regim Lahem. When we call Makom, Begadel Kan V'Domel Kushi Nidmehu Ufasul. If you have one that grows here, wherever here is, and it's supposed to be of the ordinary species of esrog, but it looks now like a kushi esrog, so it's possible because it ain't right. So technically speaking, objectively, a kushi is kosher on its own, but once it's compared to everything else, so now something looks too much like a kushi when it shouldn't, so you have a problem. This would be the case also, like the Mishnah says. When you have it, you have certain people who are very dark, like a kushi, so it's hard to tell the tzaras on them. So to get people who are, the Gemara says a germani. A germani is too white. So also this is Nagayim. So the nega looks different on the Germani, and we know that they're referring to classical era already. Even though Jews started calling Germany Ashkenaz in the medieval period, and only Jews called it Ashkenaz because Ashkenaz is somewhere near Turkey, the Ashkenaz of the Bible, that is. Jews called it that, but even earlier, a place called Germania or Germania is mentioned many times in the Mishnah and Gemara and in secular writings. The Jews were just transliterating. And that's the modern day Germany of today. And those people were known to be whiter than, let's say, the people in Italy, who were more Mediterranean. And the Mishnah says there, what does it say about the skin color of Bnei Yisrael? Bnei Yisrael are not as white as the Germans, not as dark as the Kushim, but somewhere in between. Okay, so what happens? It turns out, people have noticed this forever. Hillel Zakin's Shita is that if you live in a place where it's sunnier, people adapt genetically, that their skin is darker because it helps them. And if you live farther from the equator, so your skin will end up being lighter because there's no genetic pressure, there's no evolutionary pressure making you dark or keeping you dark. And so that's the thing. You can imagine your great-great-grandchildren are slowly going to get more olive skin. It's also better for them. Okay, so be prepared. It's also, someone said that blue eyes and green eyes are a very new genetic phenomenon among human beings. You know that? Yeah, many of us have that, but it's a genetic. It's a recent genetic mutation. But enough of that for now. So I'll read you the note we have here. Ethiopian and Esrogan are dark. Others, Ethiopian is irrelevant. That's not how you translate. It's a borrowed term. Okay, it just means a dark esrog. For example, Rambam, who lists shachor instead of kushi as a psul. Rambam is notably Paskins shachor as opposed to Lavan. He doesn't mention kushi because to him he actually lived in these places. He might have even been aware of this. He would have interpreted the Gemara differently from Rashi, like he does many times. And he says kushi just refers to the color. It's a borrowed term. It means a darker esrog. Okay. He says shachor instead of kushi as a pusul. I like that because the farther south you go, it doesn't mean the esrogs are darker. It just makes them more yellow. Okay. Let's see what else. We're going to see the Rif. You guys here have a thing of the Rif here? I included on the sheet. But first, you could see in the Rambam. I have their Mishnah Torah Hilchos Lulav Chet Zayin Parak Chet Halacha Zayin. So the Rambam says Shachor Levan Menumer. Okay, it says Mishnah Torah Hilchos Lulav. The Rambam has it that a Shachor and a Levan and a speckled, those are all forms of pasul. And then he says the last line. I put in bold for you. I know I have it bold here. Makom she'es rogim shelahem ke'ein shachris meuta ksherim. A place where their esrogim are a little bit dark, so those are kosher. If they're really dark, like an Adam Kushi, see, doesn't mean a place. It means the esrog is dark, just like a person from Kush happens to be dark. Hareza pasul b'chol makom. So he says pasul everywhere. That's a little bit different than the way Rashi described it. So he says shachor is bad. Shachor is pasul. That means completely like this. And if it has a little shachris, it's shacharuth. I said it in Ashkenazis. In Ashkenazis, shacharit and shacharut are pronounced the same way. Okay, so it has a little darkness to it. It's kosher, and if it's really dark, so it would be pasul. That's the Rambam's, no matter where it is. And his dispensation is in some places you could get away with a slightly darker esrog. That's not exactly the way Rashi had it. You could just read Rashi and compare this to Rambam. So that is that's there. We could skip here to the Rif. What does the Rif say over here? The Rif mentions that there's his shot in the peeled esrog. Okay, You could look at that. That's the first paragraph, but I think let's skip to the second paragraph here on the Rif. Kushi puzzle. He quotes the Gemara. V'atanya kushi kosher, domila kushi puzzle. Okay? It says in the Brisa, same kasha. Kushi's kosher, but domila kushi is puzzle. And then he brings what Rava says, and then he gives a perush. I'll read the perush. Perush, livnei Eretz Yisrael, kushi is puzzle. Okay? If you live in Eretz Yisrael, an Ethiopian, in this case kushi means Ethiopian to him, is puzzle. The Klosha King Kushi Harbe, okay, one that's very Kushi is puzzle. Who said anything about Kushi Harbe? You know, very, very Kushi. This seems to be the source for what the Rambam's saying. Depends on how dark it is. Remember, the Rambam just said a little bit dark, somewhat dark, very dark. So he says in this Gemara, Kushi puzzle, the Klosha King Kushi Harbe. So Kushi must mean not literally Ethiopian, but dark. Dark esrog is puzzle. Kosher Kane, how much more so, a very dark esrog. Hadome lekushi shu puzzle. Okay? So here he says, V'kosher Kane kushi harbe, hadome lekushi shu puzzle. What does that mean? If it's very dark esrog, and it's domed to a kushi, so of course it's puzzle. In this case, it must be that this word kushi, hadome lekushi, means to an Ethiopian person, like the Rambam says. So kushi is puzzle, meaning dark esrog. And of course, a very dark esrog is puzzle. And what is very dark means as dark as a person who happens to be from Kush. Okay, so the Rif is using the word borrowed, sometimes not. But in this case, the esrog is not necessarily from Ethiopia. When the esrog is dark, it means a Kushi. It means, you know, like we have a person. According to Bnei Vavel, their esrogs are Kushim. Okay, doesn't mean their esrogim all come from Kush. It means their esrogim are all dark. Okay, hakushi kosher. You have a dark esrog, it's kosher. Vakushi harbehu shehu dome ladam kushi pasul. But if you have a very dark esrog, it's pasul, and that's also dark as a person. Sometimes kushi for an esrog means it has to be dark. Sometimes it means very dark, just like a person. And you notice that. Yeah, I don't think there's anybody around. Like I've never seen this in esrog, such a thing. That esrog would actually have the same, let's say, skin tone as a person who came from Sudan, let's say. Yeah. Well, imperative. I don't know. Where do you even get a dark esrogim? Do they still exist?
You don't get it. But it's not unusual.
So I think that perhaps maybe in the olden days, we used to breed them differently. Just like we have citrus fruits, you go to the store, you get grapefruits that are yellow, right? And then you get the ruby red ones, right? They taste different. They have a peel that's slightly darker. Perhaps maybe nowadays, just like someone showed, wild bananas don't have the same shape as our bananas, right? So perhaps now, because of the breeding and selective cultivation, we've actually made these darker esrogim disappear, or maybe they've gone extinct. I don't know. But I would assume that some esrogim still exist somewhere in Yemen, but it turns out they don't. They just start getting orange and then brown as they dry up. But we're not talking about on the tree. Yeah. Yeah, the whole Murkov thing only came up later, by the way. The Rambam and other Rishonim don't even discuss the situation of Murkov. No, I'm just saying they don't discuss it because it wasn't an issue. Why? It used to be here in Eretz Yisrael and surrounding areas, the only real citrus fruit they had was esrog. All these other breeds and crossbreeds came from the east later in history. So that's why lemons are common. That's one you also have to worry that they're crossbreeding with this esrogim. In Shulchan Aruch times, the lemon was still relatively new. What do they call lemons and bananas were new. The Rambam doesn't call banana. The Shulchan Aruch, what does he call? He uses he doesn't have the word banana in Shulchan Aruch. He uses as the Arabic word, the moz, or the mozish, right? You've seen that? The Shulchan Aruch, it talks about the bracha on banana. Why is there a question of bracha on banana? Because even in Shulchan Aruch times, a banana was a relatively new fruit that was unlike the other fruits, and they don't even have a native word for it. So just like when Rosh Feinstein was using a foreign word, and he uses the Yiddish, and he writes it with those the two marks, the two gershayim, to show that it's a foreign word. In the Shulchan Aruch, the word mozish is written like it's a foreign word. So too limon, he writes it limonish. Lemons were new, and it was only later that they started mixing them. And the argument was made that if you have a kilayim, a breed of a combination of lemon and esrog, of course it's not a purebred esrog. Why would you have a question about that? But it's a little bit of a difficult question. So the question is, lemons came from esrogim, it turns out. Lemon is a crossbreed from an esrog. Why do the people like lemons? Why would you crossbreed a lemon and an esrog? What kind of, you're meshugana, you ruin your esrogim. Why would you have a havamina to do such a thing? Because lemons are juicier, and you want to get the juice out of it, so you have an advantage. But then you make your your esrog tastes more like a lemon. Okay, to each his own. You can actually see this. I should have, like I said, I would have brought in some lemons and esrogim to show the difference, but I don't want to ruin all the ones I have in the tree. So let's go into the Gemara more. Everybody have their Gemara here? Good. So now we see Rishonim. I think that this Gemara would be more interesting if it was actually something that came up more often, that we'd have darker esrogim, but it's just, we don't see those anymore. It doesn't really come up. Our main problem with the color of esrogim nowadays is not that they're dark, but that they're too green. An esrog that's completely green, hasn't started the yellowing process, is invalid. So then the question they ask is that the chemicals. Yeah. So that if it has the original green, like the leaves, so that's puzzle. Once it starts yellowing, so now it's kosher. A lot of times you get the esrogim from the dealers. What's the problem? They're not even close to ripening. So what do? So you have to find a way to artificially ripen it. So they have a gas that ripens it, or they tell you put it in a bag and stick it with an avocado and an apple. You've heard about these? Just to get your esrog up. And apple's the best. I had 3 years ago, my esrog was perfectly shaped, and it was real solid, almost a bluish green. Really, totally puzzle. But I really wanted it to be ready. So you said I locked it in the box with a whole bunch of apples, and it did nothing. It took like a whole nother month. It was ready for Hanukkah, thank God. But doesn't really help you. Yeah. Okay, let's see the Gemara over here. Esrog aboser. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, but some esrogim are resistant. That's all. It takes a lot of gas. They're just too not ready. There's always the late bloomers and late ripeners. The Gemara here says Rabbi Akiva talks about boser. You mentioned this. Esrog boser Rabbi Akiva posav chachamim machshirin. Boser means not ready, not ripe. Okay. What makes it not ripe? Is it a function of its size? We'll see. Okay. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon, Amru Davar Echad. Rabba says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon basically have the same shita. What are we talking about? Rabbi Akiva, we just said it. Esrog boser is unripe, it's unqualified. What does Rabbi Shimon say? Mahi. It says in the Brisa, we have here a question. Meisers. Okay, it's in the Brisa and Meisers. Rabbi Shimon poter says esrogim bikotnam. Rabbi Shimon says that they're putter while they're still young. Okay? Or Rabbah says that the standard of valid esrog and tithing is one and the same. Tithing. We're talking about meiser here. You're supposed to tithe the fruit and the produce when it's actually ready. So he says here, you could technically, you could tithe them. They're putter. You don't have to tithe them yet. They have not gotten to that stage where they're ready to be picked or used because they're still bikot nam. The esrogim are small. It's not time for tithing. With Chazal call onas and maisris. Okay, fine. I remember. Good. So he basically says it's one standard. The same halacha with regards to valid of the esrog for ritual use on Sukkah is the same standard for when the esrog is ready to be considered a crop. Why? Because they used to eat their esrogim. What we use for lemons nowadays, that's what they used the esrog in the olden days, and even Gentiles. What's an esrog in Latin called? Citrus medica, for its medicinal properties. Okay, good. So that's this proposal by Rabbah. Okay. Amarle Abaye. Abaye challenged what Rabbah said because it's not. Maybe there's actually are different standards. Dilma lohi, perhaps not. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Akiva hacha divainan hadar veleka. When Rabbi Akiva said that, what do you say? Esrog aboser is puzzle. He was validating the esrog that's unripe for ritual use because it is lacking hidur. Hidur or hadar is actually when's the only time in the Torah we mention hadar? It means that's the definition of an esrog. Like Ramban says, hadar is how you say esrog in Hebrew. Esrog is Persian word. Okay, the Hebrew name for the esrog is hadar, and that's why all the citrus fruits nowadays in Hebrew are called hadar, and then more specifically, just like citrus, it was just like calling it the citrus. And Chazal learned from this, even though hadar in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew only meant that specific name for this fruit. In Aramaic, hadar has this issue of what became a new Hebrew word, hidur. Hadar in Hebrew becomes what word? It means to go back. Hadar. And if you Hebraicize that word, it becomes hazar. Hadar becomes hazar. There's no dot in the dalet, so it's hadar, and becomes Hebrew hazar. Now, you and I are familiar with hazar and lahazir and mechazer, all sorts of new Hebrew verbs, but that shoresh doesn't exist in the Bible. There's no such thing as the Hebrew shoresh chet zayin reish. That only applies to what animal? A pig. A pig has a shoresh chet zayin reish. To say return in Hebrew, what's the proper shoresh? Shin vav vet. Shav, lahashiv, yashuv. Okay? Both, so hashava savida. So that's the original Hebrew. But either way, Chazal understood that the fact that Torah calls this fruit hadar means it should have what we would refer to in Aramaic as a hidur, okay, a higher standard. So when Rabbi Akiva disqualified this unripe esrog, it's because that's not fitting for the mitzvah, because this mitzvah specifically calls for a hidur. But Valhasam, with regards to Maisr, is Karabanan Svirale. Maybe you would hold like Rabbanon with regards to just picking unripe esrogim. When it comes to maestros, there's no standard of hider with your crops. It's what you pick is what you pick, and then you have to, as long as it's edible. So you'd say, don't shake this esrog because it doesn't hitter, but you could still tithe it if you have a crop of small esrogim. They're unripe. Yes, and that is the din. If I pick too many of my apples before they're ripe, I still have to tithe them. Okay, that's what Abaye points out. Inami. And another argument Abaye gives. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Shimon Hassam el gesiv aser taser eis kol tvasarecha. Now it says shana v'shana. Rabbi Shimon, when he said that small esrogim are not obligated or not yet time for them to be tithed, he was saying because there's a pasuk that says, "You shall surely tithe all the grain that comes, or the grain of your seed that comes out of your field every year." Kederech shebnei adam motziin lizriyah. That which needs to be tithed is only that which can actually be fit for planting the next year. Has anybody here ever farmed wheat? No one ever. No one here is a wheat farmer? Okay. You know, you have to farm wheat. That wheat is a crop. You basically have to process it into kernels, and then you're making it, unless you're eating the kernels and cooking them a certain way, you grind it into flour. However, you have to save some of those kernels, and don't salt them, and don't cook them, and don't dry them too much. Why? Well, you could dry them in a way of preserving them, but don't do it like for food, because if you salt them too much, they won't be able to grow. You need to save a certain percentage of the crop in order to plant for the next year, right? So you have to be smart. You can't just eat your whole crop, because then you'll have nothing. So you have to plant for next year. It turns out that the only seeds that will work for planting the next year are the seeds that were allowed to at least mature properly before you cut it. And you know, you could see that that's a ma'aseh b'chol yom. You pick the fruit too early, so the seeds will not be formed, and that applies to grain and to fruits. So when Rabbi Shimon said it's not time to tithe the unripe or the too small, he says kodnam. He doesn't use the word boser. He says the smallest rogim. It's not time to tithe them because, technically speaking, they're not ready themselves to produce new fruit. By the way, that's what you do. You cut your esrog tree. Some people have even done this. How they grow their esrog tree? This is our first esrog tree. When you're done with your esrog after Yontif, you cut up your esrog, save the seeds, and plant them eventually. Yeah, and you should have a lot of luck with doing that, because it's kind of fun to do this. It's a good thing to do with the kids. But however, he says here, aval hacha. Here, what's the here? Here, when Rabbi Akiva said that small esrog is not qualified for, or no, unripe esrog is not qualified for mitzvah, he would have held like the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon would say, the rabbis are right. Unripe esrog is kosher. The two lo midi. And that's all I have to say about the matter. Very strange. Normally we don't add these words. He could have just left his answer there. What does the two lo midi add? Read Rashi. Ein ladun achar davar zeh. Okay. You can't, this is without question. There's no more discussion here. Delo savar Shimon Rabbi Kiva, velo Rabbi Kiva savar Rabbi Shimon. You cannot compare their two opinions. Rabbi Kiva, it's almost like comparing esrogim to lemons, but in this case, it's comparing esrogim to esrogim. Rabbi Kiva is talking about the standard of esrog with regards to what you use on Sukkah for a ritual of nanuim, and Rabbi Shimon is talking about the standards of tithing esrogim. So we'll stop at that. So again, we'll continue with the first line over here on Lamed Vav Amud Beis. Using a mold. Wow. Anybody ever seen people do this before? I think the Japanese do that. What? Yeah. No, we're talking about growing it on the tree. They put a what? Yeah. Oh, and the rounds. Yeah, and then yeah. I heard that in Japan they have rectangular watermelons. Is that a thing? Yeah. Oh, okay. So yeah, people have done this before. You cause pressure on the fruit to make it grow into the shape you want. So that's nothing. There's nothing new about this. They just don't do it to people. It's not nice. So yeah, we do this to people metaphorically. We try to fit them into, put the round peg into the square hole, and vice versa. Molding people, yeah, and foot binding and other terrible practices. Yeah. So don't do that. But the question was, not every esrog tree is owned by a Jew. And sometimes the guy wants to do something with his esrog tree. Sometimes just the Jew doesn't know any better, and then he wants to sell them. So the question is, he put a mold. Gidelo badefus vasao kamin bria acheret pasul. He grew it in a mold, and he caused it to look like a different creature, so it's pasul. Amar Rava lo shanu ela kamin bria acheret aval kriyato kasher. Yeah, if he made it look like a banana or an apple or an orange, I guess. But if you made it just look like a superior esrog, imagine that. Have the perfect esrog mold. Some people want to esrog with a gartel, some don't. So you have the perfect esrog mold. You make a whole bunch of them so that every single esrog on the tree, some will come out esrog shaped and some will come out gartel shaped, and you could make a good killing on that. So is that kosher? Rava says, yeah, that would be technically kosher. Okay. Rashi says if he molded the esrog to look like a gear or a cog, it's still valid according to Rava. Okay. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch does it. What do you mean gear or cog? He says, why? There's a question here on Rava. Shita kamin briacheres. Of course, what Rava's saying is obviously says the mold that disqualifies the esrog is a mold that makes the esrog look like a different bria. But if it stays esrog shaped, you just improved it. It's like, I guess, putting a bag over the esrog, doing whatever you can to protect the esrog while it's still on the tree. They do. Yeah, they put bags on the esrogs on the tree. Molds. You'd always get, so maybe it's difficult. Maybe it's not worth the effort. I don't know. It says here, Lo tzricha davida dape dape. Rava's teaching you about the case of dape dape. That is, if he molded the esrog to look like a gear or cog, it's still valid according to Rava. What do you mean? He has a mold. I guess you could look at it from the bird's eye view. It actually makes it the esrog look extra bumpy. Okay? Imagine that an esrog, when you look at it from top, it looks rounded, but it actually has blitas all around. Like he says, a gear or a cog. What's Rashi's word for such a thing? Dape dape, Rashi says, is kamin krushim, ke'en galgal shel richayim shel mayim. It looks like the gear in the water mill. Okay? They used to have, a water mill has to have a gear that's turn two wheels. If you just have two wheels next to each other and they're perfectly smooth, they won't turn each other. To make a gear, you have to have some interlocking part. So that's what he says, the dape dape. The Rabbi Chanal says the diffuse is to make it cubic. He says, and that's why they would do it. Okay. He says, Rabbi Chanal says the case is not the dape dape, but what it said, no, dape dape means boards that you cubitize your esrog more, like the Japanese would do. I guess there were different types of hitters. Some people were looking for different types of aesthetics. I don't know. One more line here. Okay. Itmar esrog shenikavuha achbarim amarav ein zeh hadar. If you had an esrog that had been eaten a little bit, pierced by mice, so I guess they were gnawing away at the esrog, that's not a hitter. I guess it would be a form of psul. And there's a question over here that Rabbi Hanina apparently used to eat some of his esrog. So what's the problem with that? And that was kosher. He ate some of the esrog. Really, they have the question of chasser, but there's a comparison here. We'll just say shiny avodim de mi'isei, achbarim de mi'isei. There's a difference if an animal had eaten from the esrog or done something to like a mouse, which is disgusting, and if a tzaddik had done such a thing. Don't compare the two.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.